On the night of the 9th to 10th of September, Russia launched another massive airstrike against Ukraine. What made this attack unprecedented, however, was that Moscow directed more than 20 drones into NATO airspace, Poland. For the first time in history, Polish citizens received text message notifications warning of, quote, deneutralization of objects that violated the territory of the Republic of Poland. This is an act of aggression that created a real threat to the safety of our citizens. Read a statement from Poland's Operational Command of the Armed Forces. Polish and Allied forces were placed on full alert. 4 major airports in eastern and central Poland, Rzeszów-Jasionka, Lublin-Świdnik and Warsaw's Chopin and Modlin airports, were shut down to give fighter jets free rein to track and engage incoming targets. According to NATO's later statement, the response included Polish F-16s and AWACS surveillance aircraft, Dutch F-35s, responsible for most of the shootdowns, German Patriot batteries, and Italian refueling tankers. The last drone was downed at 6:45 AM local time. The drones identified so far were largely Gerbera-type decoys, most of which fell after running out of fuel. One reached as far as the locality of Mniszków in central Poland, and another drifted toward the Baltic coast. It cannot be ruled out, however, that some of the drones carried explosive payloads. In the town of Wyryki, one drone struck a residential building, causing significant damage. Footage shows a NATO fighter destroying a Russian drone, likely with an AIM-9 or AIM-120 missile. This marked the first time in history that NATO combat aircraft shot down Russian offensive weapons over alliance territory. Ukraine reported that Russia launched 458 aerial objects that night, including 250 Geranias, the Russian Shaheds. Air defenses downed 413, with the remainder either slipping through or crashing over Poland. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk urged calm, but confirmed that at least 19 drones had crossed into Polish airspace, coming not only from Ukraine, but also from Belarus. He announced that Poland had invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, a mechanism for urgent consultations when an ally feels threatened. Meanwhile, President Karol Nawrocki declared that a meeting of the National Security Council would be convened within 48 hours. Moscow denied involvement, claiming there was no proof that drones were Russian. Belarus, seemingly eager to distance itself, insisted it had actually warned Warsaw of the incoming drones, an attempt by Lukashenko to pose an independent actor. Hours earlier, Poland had closed its border with Belarus due to the Zapad military exercises. The United States reportedly deployed B-52 bombers to Europe, though it remains unclear whether this move was linked to the Russian attack. Let's assess the situation. Welcome to this special report. The today's unprecedented breach of Polish airspace by Russian drones during the attack on Ukraine offers a stark reminder. Geopolitical shocks can happen in an instant, reshaping economies and alliances. When military escalations redefine certainty, it pays to have tools that let you respond with agility. That is why I rely on XTB, the investment platform that gives you access to global markets right from your pocket. You can trade thousands of international stocks and ETFs, all commission-free, up to 100,000 euros in monthly turnover. When you anticipate defense stocks growing, energy markets shifting, or safe haven assets rallying amidst rising tensions, XTB lets you translate those instincts into action. The link is in the description, and by using it you support this channel. Just remember, investing always involves risk. After covering the immediate situation, which may well evolve as this text is being written and edited, let us turn to the more important part, the conclusions. What does today's incident mean for Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and more broadly, Europe and the United States? There is little doubt that the Russian strike was deliberate. Russian operators maintain control of their drones throughout the entirety of their flight path. Some media outlets have even suggested that Moscow had been preparing the attack for months, allegedly using Polish SIM cards to maintain command and control. Indeed, it is possible that Ukrainian jamming of Russian systems might occasionally cause drones to veer off course and drift into Polish airspace. Were this just one or two stray drones, as has happened before, the incident could be interpreted differently. But when more than 20 drones are involved, some of them entering from Belarusian territory, the idea of an accident can be ruled out. It was deliberate. In terms of sheer intensity, the attack did not pose a serious threat to the Polish state. Ukraine faces barrages on a scale hundreds of times greater on a daily basis. Yet the repercussions of this episode are very serious. From the Kremlin's perspective, this move serves several key purposes, but it also carries potential costs. First, it signals that seeing Europe's indecision, America's wavering posture, and Trump's naive negotiating style, Russia has chosen to take the next step in escalation, directly testing NATO's capabilities and defenses. Moscow is likely aiming to probe the air defense systems of Poland and other eastern flank allies, as well as to assess the political resolve of NATO leadership. Second, at a very little cost, these drones are cheap, mass-produced systems, Geran and Gerbera. Russia forces NATO to expend highly expensive resources, scrambling F-16s and F-35s, activating air defense batteries, and deploying AWACS reconnaissance planes. The attack also shut down 4 major Polish airports and mobilized the entire politico-military machinery of the state, and indeed the alliance. The cost asymmetry is dramatic, amounting to tens of millions of dollars. As former NATO commander in Europe, General Ben Hodges noted, the mere fact that NATO had to scramble F-16s, F-35s, Patriot batteries and other systems to neutralize drones worth about as much as a mid-range car shows that the alliance is not adequately prepared and lacks mechanisms for dealing with such threats. Hodges called for exercises to demonstrate that NATO can repel these kinds of attacks effectively and, crucially, cheaply. Everything now hinges on the response from Poland and, more broadly, the alliance. Only then it will be possible to judge whether the attack worked in Russia's favor or whether it backfired. In the scenario favorable to Moscow, the incident will end up with words of condemnation, countless cabinet and allied meetings, and little actual change. The attack would then become the first of many to follow, each time forcing NATO to use expensive systems to shoot down, quote, styrofoam drones. In that case, just as the Kremlin hopes, Europe would eventually pressure Ukraine to end the war, and without Western support, Kyiv would be forced to capitulate, one way or another. But there is also another possibility. Far worse for Russia, and far better for Ukraine, Poland and NATO. This would be a turning point. The Russian drone attack on Poland, and that is no exaggeration, could trigger a paradigm shift in the thinking of Polish and NATO decision-makers. In the long run, Russia cannot be allowed to strike without some form of punishment. The cost-effect ratio of purely defensive responses, as we have already outlined, would be destructive to NATO's capabilities and would only reinforce Moscow's conviction that Europe has learned nothing. It is therefore in the interest of Poland, NATO and Ukraine to finally accept the need for comprehensive resolve. First, Ukraine, fighting for its very survival, has developed an extensive and above all cheap domestic drone industry, now likely producing long-range strike drones, as well as homegrown cruise and ballistic missiles. It is in the shared interest of Ukraine, Poland and NATO for Ukrainian manufacturers to partner with Polish industry and expand production capacity on Polish soil. Poland should do everything possible to support Ukrainian capabilities, while in return entering into joint projects and technology partnerships with companies such as Łódź, Ukробronprom, Firepoint and Pivdenmash, ensuring parallel production for the Polish armed forces. This can also be linked to the EU's newly launched SAFE program. On the very day of the attack, Brussels announced the allocation of nearly 44 billion euros to Warsaw, roughly one-third of the program's entire budget. SAFE, short for Security Action for Europe, was launched in May this year as a new EU financial instrument enabling joint defense loans for member states. The loans are offered on a very favorable terms, with repayment periods stretching up to 45 years. Funds can be used to support EU defense programs, but crucially, in this case, also joint projects with partners like Ukraine. Coming back to the consequences of Russia's attack, we now enter a much murkier territory. Mere condemnation and NATO's demonstration that it can shoot down these drones, especially with high-end platforms like the F-35, is not enough. In fact, it risks provoking further attacks. If the alliance's response is limited to this alone, Moscow will almost certainly repeat the tactic. Again against Poland, but also against the Baltic states or Finland, on a cyclical basis. Next time, it might not just be drones, but, quote, stray cruise missiles. In such a scenario, NATO's entire eastern flank would gradually turn into a grey zone of hybrid warfare, when Russian strikes are normalized and treated as a permanent feature of the security landscape. This leads to a controversial thesis. NATO should demonstrate a symmetric retaliatory response. After 19 or more drones were launched into Poland, an identical number should be launched by the alliance against Russian territory, or against Russian systems stationed in Belarus. At the same time, NATO should communicate clearly that this is not an act of war, but a measured, symmetric counterstrike. Yet this would mean a kinetic exchange between two nuclear powers, NATO and Russia. Still, we already saw such a scenario play out in May, when India and Pakistan engaged in a sharp exchange of courtesies. Far from escalating the crisis, it paradoxically de-escalated it, by reducing the incentive for either side to repeat the provocation. For now, however, judging by the readiness of NATO's political elites, such a response looks unlikely. Even if Poland wanted to act, Washington would almost certainly hold it back. And if Warsaw moved ahead without American approval, it would risk losing the NATO's security umbrella, Article 5 itself. Once again, much, if not everything, depends on Donald Trump's decisions. There are, however, other forms of retaliation. One long-discussed option is for the alliance to take control of the skies over western Ukraine, shooting down every hostile drone or missile there. This would not mean NATO forces operating on Ukrainian soil, but rather intercepting Russian strikes above it. Such a step would both free up valuable Ukrainian resources and save civilian lives, while giving NATO forces priceless real-world combat experience. For Moscow, it would also send a clear message. Every act of aggression against a NATO member comes with painful consequences. In other words, NATO states should answer each Russian test or act of aggression with punitive measures, military or economic. Maciej Wilk has suggested, for instance, that Poland and other regional states suspend air navigation services to Kaliningrad, effectively cutting it off from air traffic. A harsher step would be to issue an ultimatum to all foreign carriers. They can fly to Russia or to Europe, but not both. This would target airlines such as Emirates, Belavia, Air Serbia or Turkish Airlines, as well as Asian carriers, above all Chinese ones. Moscow would be forced to rely solely on its own airlines. That would certainly hurt Russia. But according to off-the-record reports, Trump is pressing for the nuclear option. The timing of these leaks coincided with the drone attack on Poland. Allegedly, Trump is urging EU leaders to impose 100% sanctions on China and India, unless they stop buying Russian oil. Together, those two countries account for 66% of Russia's hydrocarbon exports, mostly crude. If the embargo also covered Turkey and the EU itself, which still imports around 9%, it would wipe out 96% of Russia's export market. And recall, estimates suggest that as much as 60% of the Russian state depends on revenues from the energy sector. Still, Trump's right-hand man, J.D. Vance, struck a different tone the very same day, insisting that Trump's goal is not to economically isolate Russia. For war-weary Ukraine, an attack on the scale of today's strike on Poland would almost count as a moment to catch its breath. For NATO, however, it is yet another and perhaps the loudest wake-up call, screaming for an adequate and decisive response. Will we see one? The hesitation and lethargy of Europe's leaders, coupled with Donald Trump's naive posture, suggests the likelihood is low. And that is precisely the conclusion the Kremlin hopes NATO will draw from this attack. Yet there remains the possibility that Moscow has miscalculated, that this assault could instead trigger the mobilization of resources and political will across the alliance, the very outcome Russia seeks to avoid at all costs.